Hello everyone, my name is Snehlata and I'm a PhD student and a PMRL fellow in the Department of Biological Sciences and Bioengineering, IIT Kanpur. Today, we will start with the new chapter that is respiration in plants. So, before studying about the respiration in plants, let's see what actually respiration is. So, during our previous classes or lower classes, we have studied about respiration and we saw that there are two terms that is respiration and breathing. They are used interchangeably, right? But does it mean that breathing and respiration are similar, or in some aspect they are related to one another? So, what is breathing? So, breathing is often used along with respiration, but breathing is basically a physical process in which there is exchange of gases. Like we are taking oxygen, we are exhaling carbon dioxide. So this process is breathing, right? So it is basically inhale and exhale of gases. Like in our case, we take O2 in and CO2 out, right? Now, how is it related to respiration? So, in simple terms, if we have to explain respiration, so respiration means that it is a process or it is a cellular process. Means it occurs at cell level and it produces energy. Okay. So respiration, where this breathing is a physical process, right? It is a physical process. But respiration it's a cellular process, or you can say it's a physiochemical process that we'll see how. So it occurs at cellular level and produce energy Now, so we are seeing from these two, we are seeing these are totally different. Like one is just inhale and exhale of gases, and the second is this that produces energy. But these two processes are related. So, but these both are interrelated. Now, how they are interrelated? And both are interrelated and important for proper body functioning, and they are important for proper body functioning. Now, the question is how they are interrelated. So, they are interrelated because when we breathe, we take oxygen, right? And this oxygen is utilized somewhere in the cell to produce energy. And by this way, this process, these two are related. Okay. Now, if we talk about that the ultimate goal of respiration is to produce energy. So if you talk about the source of energy, so what do we know about the source of energy? We know energy is very important. It is utmost important for the functioning of the body. So if in simple terms, what is the source of energy? So we can say food, right? Because we know it is called, if you eat food, you feel energetic. Otherwise, you will feel, if you are on fast or something, you will feel that you do not have energy. So in simple terms, you say that the source of energy is food. But what does food actually means? And for cell, what does it mean? Because ultimately this energy is required by the cells, and then these cells do various biochemical processes, which is useful for the body functioning, right? So in terms of cell, if you say, so what what does cell means? Okay. So it means the organic compounds. So food for the cell means organic compounds. And these organic compounds, what they do, they undergo oxidation. Okay. They undergo oxidation. Now we know what is oxidation. It is addition of oxygen, right? So the oxygen that we are taking, it is required for the oxidation of these organic compounds. And when this organic compound undergo oxidation, it produces energy. It produces energy. And since it is an organic compound, so you must have studied in chemistry that if organic compound undergo oxidation, it produces carbon dioxide, right? So along with the energy, it produces carbon dioxide. And then this carbon dioxide undergo, so we exhale it, right? So this, now we can see that how breathing and respiration is related, okay? Now, based on the source of energy or the food, the organisms can be divided into two types. And we are studying this since a very lower classes. That organisms, based on the food, they can be divided as autotrophic, and heterotrophic, right? Now, autotrophic means that they produce their own food, right? They produce their own food. Now, what do we mean by their own? We also produce their own food. We prepare our own food, right? But the food that we are talking is in terms of with respect to the cell meat, and that is what organic compounds, right? So the autotrophics are the one that produce their own foods or they synthesize their own organic compounds from inorganic compounds. Okay, from inorganic compounds and light. Okay, and we know the examples of autotrophic organisms. These are plants, because plants take inorganic materials from their surrounding, from the environment. Say it's what it is, nitrogen, say it's carbon, everything they take inorganic and then they produce the organic compounds from it, right? So plants, bacteria such as cyanobacteria, because the cyanobacteria, they also do photosynthesis, right? So after taking everything inorganic, they produce organic compounds. Now, what do you mean by heterotrophic? The heterotrophic means that they depends on other for this organic compound needs, right? So they depends on others for the food. Okay. And the example, we have plenty of examples, including us. So, but if we talk about plants, so in plants, most of the cells are autotrophic. Okay. But there are certain cells, those are heterotrophic. For example, root cells. Root cells. Because we know that plants, how they do make their food, they make their food by photosynthesis, right? And for photosynthesis, what it requires? It requires light. But the root cells, they reside under the soil. So there is no excess of sunlight to them. So they depends on this other parts of the plants or other cells of plants for their food. Hence the root cells are heterotrophic in nature. Apart from this, they are fungi, they are heterotrophic. There are certain bacteria, those are heterotrophic, and then we, animals, right? So these are all heterotrophic. So the source of food or the organic compound, based on this, the organisms are divided into two types, autotrophic and heterotrophic. And ultimately, any type of these organisms, any organism we are talking about, either it's autotrophic or heterotrophic, these organisms will ultimately use this their food to generate energy. Now, how they do generate energy? So what they do, they break the C-C bond in the organic compounds. So they break this carbon-carbon bond in the organic compound, because we know organic compound comprises of mainly carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, right? So this, and they have this backbone of carbon or chain of carbon. So they break this carbon-carbon bonds from complex organic molecules, from complex organic molecules. And once they break this bond, the energy is released. Okay. And this energy is stored in other bonds. Okay. So they break their carbon-carbon bond from the organic molecules to produce energy. To produce energy via oxidation. Okay. And this breaking of carbon-carbon bonds via oxidation, this is known as respiration. This is known as respiration. Okay. So this is the definition of respiration. So now we understood that what is respiration, what is breathing, how they are related. Okay. So let's talk about the basic features of the respiration. Respiration. So the first feature is, we know it's a cellular process that I have written in the previous slide itself, that it occurs at cellular level. So respiration is a cellular process. Now the second thing is, it is a physico-chemical process. The feature is, it is a physico-chemical process. Now, what do I mean by physico-chemical process? And also, have you heard of this term before? So yes, when we study about photosynthesis, there also we saw that photosynthesis is also a physico-chemical process. Now, how it is a physico-chemical process? Because it has two terms, right? The physical and chemical. So it means that in respiration, both physical changes as well as chemical changes take place. Okay. So what is a physical change that is happening in the respiration? We have seen, right? The physical change is exchange of gas. So exchange of gases. That is a physical process. And what is a chemical process? The chemical process or chemical changes oxidation. We are doing oxidation, breaking bonds. Hence, we are changing the chemicals, right? From complex to making simpler ones, making ATP energy. So these all are chemical changes. So the first feature of the respiration is it's a physico-chemical process. Now, the second feature is it is a amphibolic process. Amphibolic process. Now, what do I mean by amphibolic process? So the amphi means, neutral, right? So we know that we in metabolism, it's of two types, catabolic and anabolic. Catabolic is when something breaks. Anabolic is when something is made. Now you can ask that here we have seen or said that respiration is breaking of carbon-carbon bonds. So it should be a catabolic process. So the answer is partially true that it is mainly a catabolic process. But at the same time, when we will study forward, we will see that it will lead to the formation of certain new products. Okay. And hence it is also leading to the formation apart from breaking. And because of this reason, it is a mixture of anabolic plus catabolic process. But mainly it's a catabolic process. Okay. A mixture of anabolic and catabolic process because it is involved in both synthesis and breakdown. Involved in breakdown and synthesis that we will see. Okay. But majorly it's a catabolic process. Okay. Now, what is the third feature? The third feature is it is an exergonic process. It's a exergonic process. Now, what does exergonic means? Exergonic means that it is releasing energy. So exergonic means release energy. So like I said in the previous slide that the carbon-carbon bond, it breaks. And when it breaks, the energy is released. But this energy, it has to be stored in some form. It's not like the energy is released and it is instantly getting used. So if this thing will happen, if this thing starts to happen, we'll have need food all the time, right? But it does not happen, right? Once we eat food, it will be like the energy that will be produced. We can use it up till 6 hours, 8 hours, right? And sometime during the fasting, it goes for a day, right? So it means that the energy that is released by breaking this bond, it is not used instantaneously, right? So it is stored. So the release energy, it is stored in different bond. Okay, stored in the bonds, other type of bonds in ATP. Okay, so ATP, it is what? It is the energy currency. So it is the energy currency and it is available anytime so that it can be directly used when the energy is required. Okay. So it is an exergonic process. So although this release energy, but this energy is stored in other bonds in ATP. Okay. Okay. Next, if we talk about the reaction that takes place in the respiration, so the reaction will look something like this. It will look, it is the simplest form of the reaction that I'm showing. So it looks like this. Okay, it will produce 6CO2 plus 6S2. Okay, but from looking at here, what we are seeing, we can say that it's a single step process, right? But this is not true. It comprises of multi steps. So this is a simple reaction, although this is a simple reaction, but it has multiple steps in multiple locations. And that ultimately leads to the formation of this carbon dioxide. Okay, so this is a multi-step process. It is a multi-step process. Okay, and this multi-step process involves what? You have alcohol, because it's an oxidation, it will get converted into aldehyde, it will get converted into acid, and then it will ultimately get converted into carbon dioxide. So these multiple steps take place. Okay. Now, fifth point is it is a slow process. Okay. That's why the respiration, what we are seeing, that it is a slow process. That's why we cannot, rely on this food that whenever we need energy, at that moment only we can get energy via this process because it is slow. Hence, energy is stored in a more reliable form or the form that can be more rapidly used, that is ATP. Okay. So this is a slow process and controlled by enzymes. Controlled by enzymes. Okay. Okay. Now, one of the important point is that breathing, it might not be true that all cells breathe, but this is true that all cells respire. Okay, because every cell requires energy, and energy can come from via this process of respiration. Hence, the important point is that all cells respire. Okay, all cells respire. Although they do not breathe, but they respire. Okay. Okay. So with this, we have covered the basic about the respiration. Now let's talk about plants. So the question is, do plants breathe? Or the more appropriate question will be, do plants respire? Do plants respire? And the answer is yes. Okay. Plants do respire. Okay. But what is different between the respiration of the plant or our respiration or their breathing or our breathing is that because we know that in animals we have a special respiratory organ, right? But in the case of plant, this is not true. So the plants do not have special respiratory organs. They do not have special respiratory organs. Okay. Unlike us, we have special respiratory organs that comprises of lungs, right? And here, the every part of the plant in our body we talk about. So our body, different parts are specialized in doing different functions, right? The stomach will do digestion, the lungs will do respiration and breathing, the cardiovascular system, it will do blood pumping, blood flow, right? Transportation. But in plants, every part of the plant take care of their own needs. Okay. So they are self-sufficient. So every part of plant, every part of plants take care of their own needs. Take care of their own needs. Okay. The third point is also not what I am saying is that every part is taking care of their own need. But in our case, what happens? The lung do the respiration, but it does not mean that all the oxygen is getting consumed in the lungs only, right? Because every cell will need to produce energy for their need. So the oxygen that is taken up by the lungs, it gets transported. Okay, it gets transported to all other organs where the respiration takes place or the utilization of oxygen takes place. But in the case of plants, every part is self-sufficient to take care of its own need, and there is no little transport of gases. Okay, so every part is taking their own gases. They are absorbing gases from the environment. It's not like that some part is doing absorbing the oxygen and it is getting transported to some other region. So there is no or little transport of gases. Transport will happen only when the part that is not exposed, say roots. Okay, so there the transportation can take place. So there is no little transport of gases. Now, also, it requires this different parts require little energy that is easily like this transport. Whatever transport is happening, it can be easily done via diffusion. The transport of gases, because there is very little transport, the transport of gases can be easily done via diffusion. Okay. Also, the most exchange take place where at the leaves, because leaves are doing most of the work. They are making food. Okay. So, most exchange of gases, most exchange of gases, it is taking place where it is taking place in the leaves. Okay. So, this is about the plant that yes, they do breathe, but every part of the plant does so. Okay. And also, they have very little requirement of transportation of gases. And this simply takes the diffusion. Okay. Now, let's talk about the respiratory substrates. What are respiratory substrates? So, respiratory substrates are the one, these are the compounds that I was talking about that undergo breaking, right? So, these are the compounds inside the cell. These are the compounds inside the cell that undergo oxidation to produce energy. That undergo oxidation to produce energy. Okay. So basically, in simple terms, if you say what is respiratory substrate, so these are foods for cells. These are food for cells. Okay. So these are the compounds that is present inside the cell or they are transported inside the cell and then they undergo the oxidation to produce energy. Okay. Now, what are the examples of this respiratory substrate? So the first substrate is carbohydrates. The first substrate or respiratory substrate is carbohydrate. And carbohydrates are the most common respiratory substrate. So if a cell has given carbon dioxide as a carbohydrate, protein, fat, so it will preferentially utilize carbohydrate. Okay, so it is the most common substrate. Okay. Among this, because carbohydrates, we know it is of different types. There are monosaccharides, disaccharides, polysaccharides. So what type of carbohydrate is most common to use as a respiratory substrate is monosaccharides. Specifically, monosaccharides, in that too, specifically glucose and fructose. Glucose and fructose. Okay. So the carbohydrates are the most common. In case, what I said that monosaccharides are most common. In case, suppose a cell gets sucrose, so it will not directly utilize those sucrose, but first it will break that sucrose. Okay, so sucrose will first broken into glucose and fructose, and then this glucose and fructose they'll be used as a respiratory substrate. Okay. Now the second is fat. The fat it is not the most common substrate for the cell, but it is most energy yielding substrate. So it is most energy yielding substrate. So if you have a carbohydrate, say of same amount, a carbohydrate is there, fat is there, and if you do oxidation of both of these, the fat will produce most energy. Still, the body do not use fat as a primary substrate for respiration. The reason we will see shortly. Okay. The third one is protein. And protein, we know it's a chain of amino acids. And the first one is organic acids. Okay. So organic acids, for example, malic acid, oxalic acid. So these are used as a substrate for respiration. Okay. Now, what I told that carbohydrate is the most common, but if a cell use carbohydrate or fat as a respiratory substrate, if it is using carbohydrate and fat as respiratory substrate, then that type of respiration is known as floating respiration. That type of respiration is known as floating respiration. Okay. When carbohydrate and fats are used. When protein is used as a uh, substrate for respiration, then it is known as protoplasmic respiration. When protein is used, it is known as protoplasmic respiration. Okay, so based on the substrate, the respiration can be of different types. But the important point is that carbohydrate is the most commonly used substrate. And it's not like all the carbohydrates, if you will give starch, because it is also a carbohydrate, but the cells won't use it as a for respiration. Okay, so it should be glucose and fructose. Otherwise, if we have disaccharide, the cell will first try to break it into the monosaccharide, glucose and fructose. Otherwise, if it is not able to break it, it won't use it. Okay. Now, so we have talked about the compounds that undergo respiration. Now, what are the compounds that do not undergo oxidation? Or we can say they are not respiratory substrates. They are not respiratory substrates. Although they are present inside the cell, they are not respiratory substrates. And the examples are vitamins. Okay, vitamins, minerals, water. Water is present most abundantly, but it is not a respiratory substrate. Hormones. Okay, so these cannot be used as respiratory substrates. Okay, now let's move to the respiratory quotient or RQ. So what is RQ or respiratory quotient? So we have a cell. Okay, we have a cell. Now in the cell, we know that respiration is taking place. So we are taking oxygen, and then this oxygen along with the glucose, it is getting converted into CO2 plus energy, right? And this CO2 is then exhaled out. Okay. Now, what is respiratory quotient? So respiratory quotient describes that how many molecules of carbon dioxide is produced by using a particular molecule of oxygen. Okay. So it is this respiratory quotient is the ratio of molecules of CO2 evolved to molecules of oxygen formed. Okay, so it is CO2 evolved to oxygen formed. Basically, CO2 evolved by O2 consumed. Sorry, O2 consumed. Consumed. Okay. Consumed. So this ratio is known as respiratory quotient. Okay. Now different biomolecules have different respiratory quotient. For example, for fat, the respiratory quotient is 0.7. For protein, it is 0.9. For carbohydrate, suppose glucose. Carbohydrate, say glucose. What respiratory quotient do we have? So from this reaction, we can see we have 6 molecules of CO2 formed when 6 molecules of O2 is utilized. So the respiratory quotient is, I said, that is 1. Okay, the highest respiratory quotient is a carbohydrate. Okay. Now, the important point is what is the significance of this respiratory quotient? So the significance is lower the respiratory quotient, it means more oxygen is required. More oxygen is required. Okay. So lower is the respiratory quotient of a biomolecule or an organic molecule. It means more amount of oxygen is required to oxidize that biomolecule and to produce energy. So if a molecule has higher respiratory quotient, it's good because by utilizing a small amount of oxygen, it can produce energy. And that's the reason we do not use, or our body do not use fat as a primary respiratory substrate. Okay, because for fat, we can see it has the lowest respiratory quotient, which means to break down the fat to produce same amount of energy as carbohydrate, we will need higher oxygen. Okay, so for fat metabolism, for fat metabolism, more oxygen is required. More oxygen is required as compared to carbohydrate. As compared to carbohydrate. And because of this reason, this fat is not used as a primary respiratory substrate, but carbohydrate is used. Okay. So this is about the respiratory quotient. Okay. Now the question can be like this. Suppose you have given different compounds. It has asked you for the RQ values. So say RQ value of palmitic acid. Palmitic acid. Okay. Then the second you can have glycine. Third you can have glucose. Okay. Under aerobic and anaerobic condition. So what will the RQ value? So we know what is palmitic acid. Palmitic acid is a fat, right? So in this respect also we can write that its RQ value will be 0.7. Glycine, it's a part of protein, so it will have 9.9. And glucose, it's carbohydrate, so it will have 1. But all these are under aerobic condition. Okay. All these are under aerobic conditions. These are under aerobic conditions. Now, if anaerobic condition is given, under anaerobic condition, what happens? We do not require oxygen, right? Oxygen is not utilized. So in anaerobic condition, the RQ value will be 0. Okay. So RQ will be 0 in case of anaerobic condition because here we are not using oxygen, right? Okay. Now, so we have discussed about respiratory substrate, respiratory quotient. Now let's move to the types of respiration. So there are 2 types of respiration, and these types are aerobic and anaerobic. Okay. The respiration is of 2 types, aerobic and anaerobic. Now, what is the difference between aerobic and anaerobic? So the aerobic is what we all know. It occurs in the presence of oxygen. Occurs in the presence of oxygen, and it occurs in the absence of oxygen. Absence of oxygen. Okay. Now, when the aerobic respiration occurs, it leads to the complete oxidation of the substrate. Okay. So it leads to the complete oxidation of substrate. And how do we know that complete oxidation is happening? So the complete oxidation happens, it means that that substrate is getting converted into carbon dioxide. It means the substrate, it ultimately gets converted into carbon dioxide. So this is the complete oxidation. While in the case of anaerobic respiration, what happens? Incomplete oxidation takes place. So incomplete oxidation of substrate. Okay. So instead of carbon dioxide, something else is formed, and it shows that there is incomplete oxidation. So like I said, so in this case, the end product will be CO2 plus H2 and then energy, right? And in this case, the end product will be, depending on the type of anaerobic respiration, it can be alcohol, some alcohol, or it can be lactic acid. Okay. So these can be the end products. In aerobic respiration, more energy is produced. Okay. Because here what we are seeing, it's complete oxidation. And we also see that at what step the actually this energy production takes place. But in the case of aerobic respiration, more energy production takes place. More energy production takes place. While in the case of anaerobic respiration, less energy is produced. Comparatively, less energy is produced. Okay. So these are the difference between type aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Now we'll study about these respirations one by one. So let's start with aerobic respiration. So what is aerobic respiration? So what happens in aerobic respiration is, this is your cell. Okay. This is your cell. Now in the cell, we know we have different organelles, but we are going to draw only one organelle that is important. And that organelle looks something like this. And we know what this organelle is. This organelle is known as mitochondria, right? So this is your cell. We have another organelle that is your mitochondria. Okay. Now in the mitochondria, we know there are two membranes. The outer membrane, just like cell, it has two membranes, the outer membrane and the inner membrane. Inner membrane. Okay. And then it has this finger-like projections. These projections are what? These are known as cristae. And on this cristae, we have a structure located like this. And these structures are known as F0, F1 particle. F0, F1 particles. Okay. Then we can see that between inner and outer membrane, we have this periplasmic space. Okay. We have this space known as periplasmic space. And this is mitochondria. They have their own DNA, cellular DNA. They have ribosomes. And because of this reason, these mitochondria is known as semi-autonomous organelle. Okay. So this information we have. Now, how this information is related to respiration and energy production? Let's see. So what happens in the case of aerobic respiration? The glucose, and this region we know this is cytoplasm, right? So the glucose, it gets converted into acid that is known as pyruvate or pyruvic acid. Now it is happening where? In the cytoplasm. Okay. And this process is known as glycolysis. This is your first process. Now this pyruvate, it gets transported. It gets transported into the mitochondria. Okay. This pyruvate gets transported into the mitochondria. Now, this pyruvate upon transportation, it gets converted into acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA. And this acetyl-CoA then enters into the Krebs cycle. So this is your Krebs cycle that we will study. And then this Krebs cycle, it will ultimately lead to the production of carbon dioxide, water, and the electrons that will be produced, that will go to this F0, F1 particle. Okay, that will go to this F0, F1 particle and then ultimately leads to the production of ATP. So these all processes are happening in the case of aerobic respiration. So this is a process 1, then this is a process 2, this is a process 3, and this energy production is a process 4. So let's name them, that what are these processes. So the first process is glycolysis. Glycolysis. And the location of glycolysis is what? It is cytoplasm. Okay, it is cytoplasm because we are seeing this region is cytoplasm. Okay. The second process that is happening is conversion of pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, and this is known as link reaction. It is known as link reaction. And this link reaction where it takes place? It takes place in the mitochondrial matrix. So this reason is what? This is your mitochondrial mitochondrial matrix. Okay. So the link reaction takes place in the mitochondrial matrix. Now, third reaction we have is Krebs cycle, or it is also known as TCA cycle. So, what happens where the Krebs cycle is happening? That is also happening in the mitochondrial matrix. And the fourth is finally the energy production, and this energy production takes place in the by the electron transport system, or ETS. Okay, that is electron transport system. And where does this ETS happen? It happens in the inner mitochondrial membrane. Okay, so there will be pumping of electrons and everything that we'll see. So it happens in the inner mitochondrial membrane. Inner mitochondrial membrane. Okay, so in aerobic respiration, it comprises of the 4 steps, and these 4 steps occur at different locations that are mentioned. Okay, now let's move to the first step, that is glycolysis. So, what is glycolysis? The glycolysis, as the name suggests, it comprises of 2 terms, that is glycose, and the second term is lysis. So, the term glycose means it is associated to carbohydrate, or you can say sugar. So, the glycolysis means breakdown of sugar. Okay. Now, this, okay. So, this glycolysis, it is discovered, it is also known as AEMP pathway. Glycolysis is also known as AEMP pathway. And what is the reason behind it? So the reason is because it is discovered by 3 scientists. It was discovered by 3 scientists named Emden, Meyerhoff, and Parson. And because of this, it is known as EMP pathway. Okay. Now, glycolysis location is, we just saw the location of glycolysis is cytoplasm. Right. It is located in the cytoplasm, and it occurs in all cells. Okay, is irrespective of a cell is respired by aerobic process or anaerobic process, but this glycolysis occurs in all cells. Occurs in all cells. You can also remember this by, as you can see that it occurs in cytoplasm, and the cytoplasm is present in all type of cells, even if they do not have mitochondria, right? So the glycolysis, it can happen everywhere. Okay, so hence it occurs in all cells, even if a cell do not have mitochondria. If a cell does not have mitochondria, okay, such as in our body, the cell is IBC, right? But there also the glycolysis will happen. Okay, so if it is happening in all cells, it means that it is common step in both aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Okay, so it is a common step in both aerobic and anaerobic respiration. And because here we are seeing it occur in all cells, means it is a universal step or a universal process. Okay. Now, in this case, when we'll see the cycle, we'll see that although it is related to glycolysis, it is related to respiration, and respiration in turn is related to utilization of oxygen and production of carbon dioxide. But in the glycolysis process, there is no involvement of carbon dioxide and oxygen. Okay, so there is no involvement of carbon dioxide and oxygen in this process. Okay, Now, if you talk about the substrate of glycolysis, the substrate is glucose and fructose. And we have seen if sucrose comes, then it should first break into glucose and fructose by utilizing an enzyme known as invertase, right? So the sucrose, if the substrate is sucrose, it has to convert it into glucose and fructose by using enzyme known as invertase. Okay, so this is the substrate. Now, this glycolysis is a 10-step process. So, like I said, that respiration is multi-step process in which one of the processes is glycolysis, and this glycolysis itself is a 10-step process. So it involves 10 steps. And the final product that will be formed out of glycolysis is the final product that is formed out of glycolysis is 2 molecules of pyruvate. 2 molecules of pyruvate. Okay. So this is about the general information about the glycolysis. Now, this glycolysis, it occurs in 2 steps or 2 phases. So the glycolysis has 2 phases, and these are, the first phase is known as preparatory phase. Preparatory phase. The second is known as payoff phase. Payoff phase. Now, what happens in these phases? We will see one by one. So the first step is known as preparatory phase. So preparatory phase is what? It is an energy consuming phase. Okay. Preparatory phase is a energy consuming phase. Okay. So in this phase, basically what is happening, although the complete glycolysis will lead to the formation of energy, but the first phase, that is preparatory, in which the energy is being utilized. And why this energy is being utilized? It is utilized to activate glucose. So energy is consumed to activate glucose. Now, once that glucose will be activated, it will lead to the formation of ATPs. Okay. So the preparatory phase, it comprises of 3 steps. So the diagram here is representing the complete glycolysis steps. Okay. So it has all the 10 steps, but the preparatory phase, it will have only 3 steps. So it will be from here to here. Okay. So it has 3 steps. And these all 3 steps will lead to the activation of glucose. So the first step is, in the diagram, you can see that this is the first step. So what is happening in the first step? In the first step, the glucose, we know that glucose we have, the cyclic ring of glucose, it looks like this, right? So you have CS2OH, OH, 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 and based on alpha and beta, the OH can be anywhere. Here I am drawing alpha glucose, okay? So we have glucose. Now, this glucose in the first step, it is getting converted into glucose 6-phosphate, right? So now we have glucose here. What is happening? At the 6th position or the 6th carbon of the glucose, a phosphate is getting attached. So how it will look? It will look something like this. This will be your structure. And which is the 6th position? The 6th position is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So this is your 6th position. Okay. Now at the 6th position, the phosphate is getting attached, which means that instead of this H in the OH, now it will have phosphate. And this will form your glucose 6-phosphate. Now the question is, from where this phosphate came? So the phosphate comes from this ATP. Okay. So here the ATP, it is getting converted into ADP, because we know ATP means adenosine triphosphate. So here it has adenosine structure with 3 phosphate group attached to it. Okay. Now what it gets converted into ADP, that is adenosine diphosphate, which means 1 phosphate is released. And this phosphate is being utilized by the glucose to get converted into glucose 6 phosphate. Okay. Now, which enzyme is responsible for this? So the enzyme that is used for this conversion is a kinase, because the kinase, just remember, these kinase are always associated with the addition of phosphate group. Okay. So the kinase, if there is an enzyme named kinase anywhere involved, it means it is adding phosphate group. So it is involved in the addition of phosphate groups. Now, so here the enzyme that will be used is kinase, but this glucose is what? It is 6 carbons, right? It is 6 carbon molecule. So the kinase here is hexokinase. Hexo means 6, right? So it is named as hexokinase. So this is the first enzyme. This is the first step. Now what happens in the second step? So second step, as we can see, is that here this glucose 6 phosphate is getting converted into fructose 6 phosphate. Okay. So in the second step, glucose 6 phosphate, we have seen the structure. So glucose 6 phosphate getting converted into fructose 6 phosphate. Now, what do we know about glucose and fructose? What it has in common? So the common thing is that both have isomers, right? The glucose also have 6 carbon, the fructose also have 6 carbon, but there is just the rearrangement of the carbon molecules. One has aldehyde group and another has a ketone group. So these are isomers, right? So this isomers, so hence the glucose is getting converted into the fructose, and the enzyme that is responsible for it is known as isomerase. Because isomerase do what? They produce isomers. Okay. Now the third step is, and this step is this glucose 6 phosphate to fructose 6 phosphate is a reversible reaction. Okay. So it does not mean that once the fructose 6 phosphate is being formed, it will necessarily go in the forward direction. It can also come back and again form the glucose 6 phosphate. So this is a reversible reaction. Okay, so second step is what? It is reversible. While the first step is, it is irreversible. Okay. Now, what is the third step? So the third step is fructose 6 phosphate. This fructose 6 phosphate, it gets converted into fructose 1,6 phosphate. Fructose 1,6 bisphosphate. Okay. So if you remember the structure of fructose, this fructose, it looks something like this. And it has 6 phosphate already written, which means that its 6th position, here is your CS2OP, right? At 6th position, this is your 6th carbon. And then here is your first carbon. So at the first position, now it is saying this is CS2OH. And this is what? This is your fructose 6 phosphate, right? Now, what is happening here in the fructose 1,6 bisphosphate, along with the 6th position, the phosphate is now getting attached onto the first position as well, right? So the structure will become like this, CS2OP. And here is also CS2OP. So at first position and 6th position, we have phosphate group. Now again, at 6th position, we know how this phosphate came. But at first position, from where did this phosphate come? So this phosphate is again came from utilizing ATP and forming ADP. Then it will release one phosphate group, and this phosphate group gets attached at the first position of the fructose 6 phosphate. And the enzyme that catalyzes this reaction is known as phosphofructokinase. Again, this is a kinase, but its name is phosphofructokinase. Phosphofructokinase. So what we have seen here, that in the preparatory phase, there is utilization of ATP molecules. And how many ATP molecules are being utilized? These are 2. And again, this third step, that is conversion of fructose 6 phosphate to fructose 1,6 bisphosphate, it is also a irreversible reaction. It is also a irreversible reaction. Okay. So this is the preparatory phase. And in the preparatory phase, we have utilized two ATP molecules. Now, in the next class, we will start with the second phase, that is the payoff phase, and we will see that how in the payoff phase, the production of energy and the pyruvic acid takes place. So that's all for today. Thank you.